At this point, you have learned about the Middle Passage and the slave trade as it occurred in North America. And here's the triangular trade on the right, that you're familiar with at this point. We'll get back to North America very soon. However, I think it's important for us to now turn our attention to Brazil, which I've indicated here on the map, or the world map here. Um, for one, I think it's important to look at Brazil because I'm trying to provide a more global perspective in this course. And also, the large scale sugar plantation actually gets its start in Brazil and then sort of serves as a model for plantations throughout the Caribbean and somewhat in the southern British colonies of North America. The slave trade in Brazil should also serve as somewhat of a contrast to that of North America. Um, so anyway, here let's move on to the next slide now. Okay, this is a map indicating the movement of people basically throughout the transatlantic slave trade. Although many people fail to recognize this, Brazil ends up receiving about 10 times the number of slaves as that of North America. And you can see the huge numbers, the shifts going from Africa to Brazil and the Caribbean here on the map. In fact, it's about 4 million. Um, Actually, only about 5% of the African slaves are transported to what will become the future United States. And over 40% of these people are transported to Brazil. So Brazil is a huge player in this game. Um, so I guess the next question would be, who took slaves to Brazil? I guess we need to sort of understand the genesis of this. So in order to cover this, we need to rewind back to the Portuguese. Remember in a recent lecture we learned that Vasco da Gama of Portugal was able to circumnavigate or basically sail around Africa, and this was really important because it ended the Muslim and Italian monopoly on the traded goods from the East, right, from the Orient. Um, and this basically allowed the Portuguese to uh, trade with the Asians directly. So let's move on to the next slide. And approximately in about 1500, a Portuguese fleet was on its way to the Orient, to the East, and it was blown off course. The captain was Pedro Alvares Cabral, and his crew basically got to Brazil by accident. The ship was on its way to India, to the Orient, as I mentioned, on its way to India to get things such as spices, right? Things that people in Europe were interested in at that point. It was blown off course, and it ended up landing in Brazil. And the land was larger than Europe, and they sent news home to Lisbon from everything I've read on how large this land was. And remember, Lisbon is sort of the center of Portugal. It's home to sailors and investors alike. Uh, Da Gama had just rounded Africa a few years earlier, and the Portuguese were absolutely shocked at how trusting the natives were whenever they landed here. And this is sort of indicated, Gabral's entrance into Brazil is sort of indicated in this painting right here. But from everything I've read, the Indians were just shocked at the natives were of how trusting. I'm sorry, the Portuguese were just so shocked at how trusting these natives were whenever they got there. There weren't any Incans or Aztecs for them to conquer, as we've talked about before with the Spaniards. The only item of interest really here was a tree known in Europe as Brazil wood. And there certainly is mining that takes place much later, more towards the north and the west. But that's the only thing that's really of interest initially is Brazil wood. So let's move on to the next slide. What ends up taking place is Portugal ends up sectioning off Brazil's coastline to rich investors. The only problem was they couldn't send Portugal's population there because Portugal's population is basically just way too small. So they end up turning to these trusting natives that are already living there. And they basically for either forced or bribed them into slavery, much like the Spaniards had done, right? Um, or will do. And of course, the natives don't really get this because the natives are rather communistic. They don't understand the concept of overproduction, right? They don't have this market philosophy like the Europeans do, and the overproduce goods to sell them. So I guess you could say they're not really used to working for another man. They're rather communistic in many ways, and the natives end up really dying off uh, rather quickly from overwork and more so than that, all of the European diseases that they are exposed to. So by about 1600, the Portuguese end up turning to Africa for their labor. The Portuguese had recently colonized Southwest Africa, including modern-day Angola. This is where a large amount of the slaves are going to come from and are going to be transported to Brazil eventually. And you can see Angola here on the map that I have in the upper left-hand corner. Um, they were basically, as we've mentioned before with the Middle Passage, were transported much like sheep or cattle would be transported. And quickly, even Portugal's own population is going to become about one-tenth African, particularly in Lisbon, even higher than that. And slaves are used for household tasks, for emptying sewage, footmen, very huge assortment of tasks that they were used for in Lisbon. And of course, they want to make up eventually the huge population in Portugal, and I'm sorry, in Brazil. In fact, the Portuguese treat Africa, particularly Angola, is really an infinite resource of slaves. By the end of the 16th century, many owners have built their wealth uh, in order to uh, purchase these slaves. They initially build their wealth with the natives, but eventually are able to purchase these African slaves. Um, but I think it's important to talk quickly about Africa because I think it's important for us to understand the African perspective towards slavery because it's very different than the European one, and more specifically, the concept as it pertains to Portugal. There was an absence of private property, really, um, in Africa. People didn't own rights to land like Europeans did. The property was shared. People still tried to expand their wealth, but they did this through people, basically. The more wives they had, the more children they had, the more pawns they had. Pawns were basically they could were people they could use to pay debts to other people. So you can really see sort of the concept of having people. And slaves played a big part of that. Adoptees played a big part of that. The slaves were definitely a big part of that. But this is a very different way of sort of expressing how wealthy you are than the Europeans have, right? African chiefs would often pull in people with skills under them, and these people were often slaves, and they would make the chiefs look better, right? Um, and the slaves could achieve uh, greater status. They weren't always fixed. They could achieve greater status through things like such as military service. Um, However, I think it's important to mention that the general perspective was that slaves were on the lowest rung of the social ladder. People knew if you came from a slave family. They could tell by your name if you had come from a slave family. So there's definitely a stigma there of someone being a slave. Um, uh, you could get, but I think it's important to mention though that you could get out of slavery, and there was this idea really of reciprocity that existed between slaves and slave owners. You know the slaves were always good to the owners as long as the owners, the chiefs, were good to the slaves. So there's not that concept of property of chattel is not as evident as there is with the Europeans. And again, expressing your wealth, I know this is hard for us to wrap our minds around, many of us, but it's how many people you obtain. And in fact, slaves could actually own slaves. As hard as that as difficult as that may sound, slaves themselves could actually own slaves. Um, but prior to the arrival of Europeans, Africans were not ever sold. Africans were obtained mostly through warfare. Um, Africans had political conflicts, like Asia, and anywhere else, like Europe, um, but they were mostly obtained whenever they would fight each other, right? So mostly through warfare. Um, Kings could often decide who could become slaves. Also, um, in fact, I think it's important to mention that kings could decide if a slave was to be slaughtered or if a slave could be arbitrarily sold to Europeans once Europeans um, entered that market. So it was not unusual for this, for slaves to sort of be sacrificial in many ways, not have a lot of autonomy, but it's hard for us to wrap our minds around. It's a different concept than the Europeans. So, what do Europeans have really that the Africans won't? Well, the Europeans have guns, they have swords, they have alcohol, and it's not that the Africans didn't have access to guns and swords and things like this, but the Portuguese and eventually Europeans in general are able to provide these much cheaper than they can get from the Arabs through these trade across the Sahara Desert. So they're able to get them a lot cheaper. Um, so the Portuguese are going to start trading with places like Angola, and as you can see here, the people who they're going to trade with are living on the West Coast. And this is actually going to provide people living on the West Coast with power that they never have had before. Most of the people who have a lot of power live in the northern and western part. They live along the area or in the interior of Africa, along the area where they have access to these trade routes to the Arabs across the Sahara Desert. So it's really going to provide a lot of wealth to the people in West Africa as well. So the West Coast people can now challenge the people living in the interior, and they've in the past have had to bow to them. So what do? Often they go to war with people in the interior, and they produce more slaves for the Europeans, and that in turn allows them to gain more guns and swords, and it creates more warfare in many ways. So I guess there's a huge economic imbalance here that's going on with Africa, and a huge population of Africans that are going to go to the Americas. So I guess the next question is, why do they need all these slaves? Why do the Europeans need all these slaves? And the answer is sugar, which you can see here in the bottom right-hand corner. Sugar was a spice. It was a medicine. But it could also do things like mask the flavor of rotting meat. And above all, it was a sweetener. Before about 1500, the world had very few sweeteners. If you wanted to sweeten your food before 1500, then you would simply use honey or fruit juices. In particular, sugar was being used with things like coffee and tea that Europeans were starting to consume. And these became popular additions to the European diet. They were especially valued as stimulants and comfort for the new European factories. As more factories are being produced as well, it just increases that. So yeah, it's a huge market. The products in turn fed the markets of the Atlantic world with cheaply manufactured goods such as hose and cast iron pots. Plantations in Europe had been small, But Brazil's land now offered big possibilities for these new markets. And sugar, and I think it's important to mention, sugar was becoming quickly huge. It was a big deal. In fact, in 1598, we can't quite verify this, but a traveler actually noted that Queen Elizabeth's teeth were black from the use of so much sugar. So sugar is quickly becoming consumed by people living in Europe. And of course, we can expect these sugar plantations end up springing up all throughout northeastern Brazil, where sugar grew very well. Um, and these spring up as early as the 1530s. Um, uh, it's not going to take long until Brazil is going to be the world's leading sugar producer. And the owners, they live like lords. A lot of the mills actually had slave prisons, and things like that. But we'll talk more about the experiences of the slaves and really the experiences of the owners as well in class. All right, but I think it's important now for us to move on to the next slide and sort of wrap up this lecture. All right, so I want us to focus more on the treatment of Africans in class. And let's see, time for a fact review here. Africans were brought to Brazil as early as 1530. So this is actually 89 years before Jamestown. A lot of times we forget that as we're talking about the American history narrative. Um, Africans were brought to Brazil as early as 1530. Abolition did not come until 1888. And Brazil received approximately 4 million Africans, over 4 times as many as any other American destination. And today, Brazil's African descended population is larger than the population of most African countries. So African culture, or Brazilian culture, has been largely shaped by this massive migration of Africans that took place. And in class, I want us to talk about those experiences, and hopefully we can relate those to how slavery has shaped Brazilian culture today by extension.